We'd like to welcome the Frozen Chosen to this distinguished lecture tonight. My name is Dennis Taylor. I'm editor of Religion and the Arts, which is the Boston College Journal, which is sponsoring the lecture. The journal has been publishing for about 7 years now, and we try to publish the best that is written on the subject of the intersection of religion, literature, and the arts. Might I alert you to our next lecture in this series, co-sponsored with the Humanities Lecture Series by Mary Gordon on March 26th, The Appetite for the Absolute, a reading of Dostoevsky post 9/11. I would now like to introduce a distinguished professor in the philosophy department, Jorge Garcia, who will introduce our speaker.
Thanks. We are honored tonight to welcome Mr. Terry Teachout. I met Mr. Teachout about 8 or 9 months ago last spring, but his reputation certainly preceded him. I'm not a great follower of the arts, I confess, but even to me, his name was known from his writings on film, theater, and some music, and from that I found out from conversation with him and with others that, in fact, that's only the tip of the iceberg, with substantial writings on literature, dance, classical, jazz, as well as pop music, television, theater, opera, the visual arts. Mr. Teachout was born in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. I didn't pronounce that right, I'm sorry. And reared in Sikeston, Missouri. His days there are recounted in a fine book that I spent some time with today, getting to know him through his reflections on his own life, a book called City Limits. He was educated at William Jewell College, a Baptist college in Missouri, as well as St. John's College, Maryland. He studied several years in clinical psychology department, a program at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. He's worked as a bank teller, a mental health center crisis counselor, a jazz bassist. Is that the word, bassist? Okay. He's as I found out from his book, an aficionado of the old What's My Line TV show, as was I a long time ago, a sort of glimpse into Manhattan nightlife, high life in a generation or so ago. But he's best known and has done his professional work as real achievement is as a writer. He's written on all of those aspects of the arts, chiefly performing, but also visual arts, for the Washington Post, where he writes a regular column on the art scene in New York City for Washingtonians. As someone who's lived in both New York and Washington, I know that must be a delicate matter to talk favorably about what there is in New York for an audience of people in Washington. He writes regularly on music for Commentary magazine. He writes regularly on film for Crisis magazine, a Catholic publication. He writes for the New York Times, Time magazine. He does for the Wall Street Journal. As well as radio commentaries for National Public Radio. He's worked as a senior editor at Harper's Magazine, which really brought him to New York City, and an editorial writer for the New York Daily News, my regular reading when I was growing up. In addition to his extensive writings in criticism across the arts, probably one of the very few people in the country who writes regularly art criticism, art reviews at this level, I mean, at the level of really the major national journals. In addition to that, he is the editor of a book, a second Mencken Chrestomathy. That was right? Okay. That was a new word for me, I must admit. which many of you will be familiar with as supplementing the works in the first Mencken, Chris Timothy, works of H.L. Mencken. He's edited the book Beyond the Boom, New Voices on American Life, Culture, and Politics. He's the author of City Limits, Memories of a Small Town Boy. Many of his, or several, I guess only a small selection really, of his books, of his works on criticism are now being collected in a book, the Terry Teachout Reader, due out this spring from Yale University Press. And probably most of you who have come across his name recently will have come across it in connection with a very well-reviewed and widely reviewed book that just came out the end of last year, The Skeptic, A Life of H.L. Mencken. As I said, I spent the much of today going over Mr. Teachout's autobiographical writings. Here's a sample near the end of his book, a reflection on the path that his own life took and drawing some lessons for it. He writes, "We are born into a vast room whose walls consist of 1,000 doors of possibility. We close some of the doors deliberately, sometimes with fear, sometimes with calm certainty. Others seem to close by themselves, some so quietly we do not even notice." Mr. Teachout's closed many paths, as evident from the rather varied career resume that I've given, but what's most important, of course, is that he's opened doors. And of course, that's quite important for the sort of work that he does as a critic of the arts. One of the ways in which certainly the arts touch us all is when they open doors to us into new realms, new modes of character, new personalities, new ways of being. As he himself writes again in a different context in his book, here he's reflecting on the ways in which his own small town has changed. It's the way people live that matter, not the way things look. Yet, in a way, isn't it the way things look that give us give us a kind of insight in the arts into the way that people live, right? Isn't it the way that some daubs of paint on a canvas can look, a piece of metal or some chipped stone that gives us some insight into the way that people live and into the ways that we could live? Let me finish with a quotation not from Terry Teachout, nor from H.L. Mencken, his most recent subject, but rather a quotation that Mr. Teachout uses as an epigraph to his own book to his own book of memoirs, a quotation from Kipling. "Day and night he strove to think out his way into the heart of things, back to the place whence his soul had come." It seems to me that this is a way of reflecting on the way in which the arts mean so much to us when we open ourselves to them, that they're ways of finding ourselves back into the heart of things, and at least for people of faith, that will mean leading us back to the place whence our souls have begun. That really will be the subject, in a way, of the reflection that Mr. Teachout offers us tonight, The Confessions of a Believing Critic. Please join me in welcoming to Boston College, his first trip here, Mr. Terry Teachout.
Thank you for coming on such a dreadful night. Do not be alarmed by the thickness of this manuscript. The type is very large. I've been on and off the road for the past 3 months giving speeches about my new book, and last week I found myself at a bookstore on the Upper West Side of New York City. At the end of my talk, I took questions from the audience, and most of them were pretty familiar stuff. People tend to ask the same questions about H.L. Mencken, no matter where I go. But then a fellow in the third row stood up, holding a note card in his hand, and I saw a certain glint of zealotry in his eye and said to myself, this guy isn't going to pitch me any softballs. And sure enough, he didn't. He started off by asking me to explain a footnote on page 90 of my book. I sighed and said very politely, perhaps it might be better if you and I chatted about that after the general questioning is over. But I didn't get off that easy. My questioner had a follow-up. He peered down at the note card in his hand and said, do you think the fact that you're a Christian prejudiced you against H.L. Mencken? Now, it is a truth universally acknowledged that nobody ever thinks of the perfect answer on the spot, so I can't claim to have looked him in the eye and said, well, no, it didn't prejudice me. I think Mencken was completely wrong about religion, but that doesn't make me prejudiced. He was the one who was prejudiced. Alas, I didn't see that one coming. It's true that the Upper West Side of New York probably contains one of the lowest per capita percentages of religious believers in all of America. But attitudes there tend to run more to indifference than open hostility, so I wasn't expecting a frontal attack from a village atheist. The fact is, it wouldn't have occurred to most of the people in the room to ask that question of me, for the simple reason that it wouldn't have occurred to them that I was religious. And I have no doubt that at least some of them were shocked to hear the news. I look normal, I sound normal, I like art. How could I possibly be religious? Now, there are a number of reasons why so many people who love art are reflexively distrustful of people who also love God, and not all of them can be dismissed so lightly. As a group, we believers don't have the best of track records when it comes to art. I was reminded of this fact last year when I had occasion to write about the film version of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Amid the reams of journalistic verbiage about how that movie broke every box office record in the history of the universe, I ran across the odd report of public protests by religious types who believed the world's most popular movie to be a tool of Satan. I knew those protests were coming, and I also knew the eye-rolling reflex they would trigger in virtually everyone who read them. It doesn't matter how unrepresentative of religious people in general the parties in question may be. Secular editors can always be counted on to play this kind of story up, precisely because it makes all believers look like prigs. And, needless to say, some of them are exactly that. I hate to keep dragging Mencken into this talk since I'm not here to sell copies of my book. I'm doing that tomorrow night at the Athenaeum. But it so happens that Mencken famously defined Puritanism as the haunting fear that someone, somewhere, may be happy. Now, Puritanism was and is a lot more complicated than that, but Mencken was onto something. You may have forgotten this, but back in the days of the Taliban, there was a department of the Afghan government called the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice. It was in charge of banning things, and one of the things it banned was any equipment that produces the joy of music, meaning musical instruments, phonographs, what have you. And not just music, mind you, but the joy of music. Give the Taliban this much credit, they didn't beat around the bush. I wouldn't say that the Harry Potter books qualify as high art, but they're definitely joyful. They're also old-fashioned moral tales whose youthful characters learn from their fanciful adventures a great deal about virtue and valor. While J.K. Rowling is not writing from the explicitly Christian perspective that animates such classic children's books as C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, the moral content of her work seems to me unexceptionable, even admirable, and I was not at all surprised to learn that she is a member of the Church of Scotland. I believe in God, not magic, she says firmly whenever anybody asks her. So why the fuss? The ostensible reason is that young Harry Potter is a student at the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, meaning that innocent children who take an interest in his exploits might develop an unhealthy obsession with the occult and thereby wander into the waiting arms of Screwtape. No doubt such things are remotely possible. I myself once tried to fly off a bookshelf after seeing Superman on TV. But the notion that the Potter books are spawning a generation of Charles Mansons seems to me laughably silly. In the ever-applicable words of the Duke of Wellington, if you can believe that, you can believe anything. The real reason, I fear, is that America contains far more than its share of earnest, well-meaning folk who don't like art, any art. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say that they don't get art. An extreme example of this tendency is the literal-minded person who can't see why anyone in his right mind would want to read made-up stories about people who don't exist. Less extreme, but more troublesome, are those who believe that art exists solely as a medium for the transmission of moral messages. Take, for instance, Mrs. Crowley, the nice but narrow-minded small-town Catholic lady in John Hassler's novel Grand Opening. Mrs. Crowley reads fiction, but only the right kind. As she puts it, "My husband and I don't read Hemingway, his philosophy's wrong. We read Catholic writers, Bernanos and Mauriac and people like that. The joke here, of course, is that Mr. Hassler is also a Catholic writer. Now, to her credit, Mrs. Crowley is not a hopeless case. She does read novels, and she probably also senses that truth has something to do with beauty, which puts her ahead of the game. She's certainly in better shape than Flo Whitaker, that agonizingly earnest left-liberal sociologist's wife, who turns up in Randall Jarrell's novel, Pictures from an Institution. Poor Flo couldn't bear to read old novels, novels written before the last 50 or 60 years. I asked, why is that? She answered, I get too upset at the status of women in those times. It was so degrading. But Flo and Mrs. Crowley, different though they are both severely confused, and confused in the same way, about the purpose of art. C.S. Lewis could have straightened them out, maybe. In addition to writing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he also penned these unforgettably beautiful words about what art does. In reading great literature, I become 1,000 men, and yet remain myself. Like a night sky in the Greek poem, I see with a myriad eyes, but it is still I who see. Here, as in worship, in love, in moral action, and in knowing, I transcend myself, and am never more myself than when I do. I suspect that at least some of the people who picketed Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone did so for the worst of reasons, which is a fundamental detestation of this miraculous ability of art to let us live in other men's skins, to test our perceptions and beliefs against theirs, and perhaps to be changed as a result. Too many religious people feel this way. I hear from them now again in my capacity as the film critic of Crisis magazine, and I try to be as nice to them as possible when they write to ask me how I could possibly have anything good to say about movies in which teenage girls use the F word or couples have sex out of wedlock. I know these kind, good, well-meaning folk probably haven't read a word of Flannery O'Connor or Evelyn Waugh, much less Etienne Gilson or Jacques Maritain, so to them I keep it simple. To you, this evening, I hope to do a bit better. I want to try to offer a few tentative, preliminary answers to a complicated question. What is the function of the believing critic? What makes him different? And I should start by pointing out that in many ways, perhaps most ways, though not necessarily the most important ways, he isn't so different from his unbelieving brethren. As the Neo-Thomists remind us, it is perfectly possible, up to a point, for the believer in God also to believe in art for art's sake. That is, that art is a realm with its own rules, not to be judged by irrelevant standards. When I hear normally sensible Catholics claiming that abstract painting can't possibly be as beautiful as representational painting, and I can't tell you how many times I've heard this, I want to sit them down with a copy of Gilson's Painting in Reality and tell them to read it 10 times in a row and then get back to me. At the same time, you don't have to be religious to understand the danger of placing art on too high a pinnacle, of making it into a kind of substitute religion. A very great art critic said this: there are, of course, more important things than art. Life itself, what actually happens to you. This may sound silly, but I have to say it, given what I've heard art-silly people say all my life. I say that if you have to choose between life and happiness or art, remember always to choose life and happiness. Art solves nothing, either for the artist himself or for those who receive his art. I couldn't have put it any better. And who spoke those wise words? Clement Greenberg, a disabused Marxist who had no religious belief whatsoever. So I think it would be fair to say that in the normal course of my work as a critic, I don't usually find it necessary to talk or write or think about religion, at least not in any explicit way. I certainly don't go around looking at paintings or ballets and muttering to myself, Soli Deo Gloria. What's more, I have a severe allergy to religious people who do this, who find it absolutely necessary to justify their liking for a work of art by cramming it into a religious pigeonhole. I find that certain Catholics are acutely susceptible to this kind of parochialism. There's a certain kind of Catholic critic, for example, who loves to write pieces about how the 10 best movies ever made, or rock albums, are all really Catholic. I hate to tell you, but it's not so. Having said all this, I hasten to add that for all my apparent similarity to your run-of-the-mill secular critic, I am well aware of certain things that set me apart from most of my colleagues, and one of them is that I am not a relativist. Turn back the clock to September 10th, 2001. If you had spent that day sitting in a classroom in any Ivy League university, listening to a lecture on literature or music or art, the chances are good that you would have heard a whole lot, about something called postmodernism. Not that I need to tell any of you about postmodernism, but perhaps it is worth pointing out that for all the reams of impenetrable prose that have been penned on the subject, its underlying premise is in fact far more straightforward than has been widely acknowledged. Postmodernists disbelieve in truth and beauty, claiming instead that nothing is good, true, or beautiful in and of itself. Rather, goodness, truth, beauty, and quality are constructs imposed by the powerful on the powerless for political purposes. Hence, there can be no great art and no great artists. Shakespeare, Beethoven, Cezanne, mere capitalist tools used to anesthetize the masses and prop up the decadent ruling classes of the West. Under the aspect of postmodernism, randomness is just as good as order, noise as good as music, and all artistic statements are created equal, though those made by the ostensibly powerless are more equal than others. Accordingly, postmodern audiences were expected to make do with the resoundingly empty gestures of conceptual art and minimalist music, in which theory replaced content. In the entire history of art, no important theoretical movement has produced more theory and less art than postmodernism. Ultimately, it amounted to little more than a set of critical attitudes, foremost among them the marginalization of the idea of beauty and its replacement with the sniggering, fearful irony light that was the hallmark of American culture in the 90s. It was, at bottom, a loss of nerve. We lost the courage of our aesthetic and cultural convictions. Clement Greenberg once wrote, "In the long run, there are only two kinds of art, the good and the bad. This difference cuts across all other differences in art. At the same time, it makes all art one. The experience of art is the same in kind or order, despite all differences in works of art themselves." Now, Greenberg was, of course, exactly right. But by choosing instead to embrace aesthetic relativism, postmodernism made possible the rise of a new generation of cultural totalitarians, so secure in their belief that the personal was political that they dismissed with ignorant contempt any art they could not reduce to a laundry list of Philistine platitudes, Philistinism being an inevitable byproduct of zealotry in all its forms. Some of you will recall that in the days immediately following September 11th, 2001, W.H. Auden's poem, September 1, 1939, crackled across the internet like a Samizdat newsletter. It was bracing in those desperate days, especially for those of us who live in New York, to open a piece of email and find Auden's prescient lines about the low, dishonest decade that was the 30s, though I remember thinking at the time that another of his poems might have been more to the point. Either we serve the unconditional, or some Hitlerian monster will supply an iron convention to do evil by. And so he has. But on September 11th, the unconditional started looking good again. For on that never-to-be-forgotten morning, Americans awakened to the crudest possible reminder that some things aren't a matter of opinion. You can't explain away 3,000 freshly slaughtered corpses. And outside of the pseudo-intellectual lunatic fringe, few tried. And those who dared to defend the indefensible were promptly relegated to the margins of respectable society, exposed for the trousered apes they are. All at once, my fashion-obsessed Manhattan neighborhood was awash in fear and bedecked with flags, and the word evil re-entered the vocabulary of a generation of educated innocents who thought there was no such thing. Something similar happened when, a few days later, musicians in New York and elsewhere around the country began giving memorial concerts to which the public flocked. What did we come to hear? Well, Yo-Yo Ma played Bach at Carnegie Hall. Placido Domingo sang Verdi at the Metropolitan Opera House. Kurt Masur in the New York Philharmonic broadcast Brahms's German Requiem to the entire country over PBS. And did anybody complain because the Met performed Verdi instead of Schoenberg or Philip Glass? To ask the question is to know the answer. In Debussy's opera, Péléas and Mélisande, old King Arkell sings, "One greatly needs beauty when death is so close." Never before had I truly understood the meaning of those words. What we wanted in our time of need was beauty, and we never doubted for a moment that such a thing existed, that it was real. Nor did we seek it in order to be healed, as the cliché went. Art isn't therapy, just as beauty is more like bread than medicine. We need it not merely to feel better, but to live. On the Sunday after the World Trade Center crumbled into dust, I flew over the southern tip of Manhattan, transfixed by the insane spectacle far below me, gaping in dumb wonder at the black hole that had been burned in my adopted home. Did postmodernism abruptly come to an end that week, the way that Virginia Woolf once claimed that on or about December 1910 human character changed? No. The change was already in the air. I'd already heard it in our concert halls, in the music of new tonalist composers like Paul Moravec and Lowell Lieberman, who had shrugged off the dead hand of the avant-garde and freely acknowledged the permanent validity of the natural law of tonality. I'd heard it in nightclubs, where jazz musicians like Diana Krall and Bill Charlap find in the Great American Songbook a permanent source of inspiration and renewal. I had seen it in the choreography of Mark Morris, whom I once took to be a postmodernist, but whom I now realize to be something completely different, a maker of dancers set to the music of Bach, Brahms, and Beethoven, a choreographer whose steps arise from his intense awareness of the hidden presence of order amid the seeming chaos of our wounded world. And I'd even seen it in movie houses, where a growing number of independent-minded American directors are making films, like Terry Zwigoff's Ghost World and Kenneth Lonergan's You Can Count on Me, that engage directly and beautifully with the problem of postmodern relativism. I don't want to sound overly optimistic. The anti-beauty brigade may be in temporary retreat, but it's nothing more than that. Such folk have two things going for them, tenure and patience. And even though they don't believe in anything, they disbelieve in it passionately. But their nihilism is no longer fashionable. Indeed, I believe that at some point in the 90s, we quietly entered a period for which no one has yet come up with a better word than postmodernism. It's a terrible word, and a better one will come along in time. But at least it has the advantage of reminding us that we are witnessing the emergence of a new generation of artists who, unlike the postmodernists who came before them, believe in beauty, who are willing to use that word without encasing it in the protective quotation marks of irony. I was talking about all this the other day with the composer Paul Moravec, who happens to be a neighbor of mine on the Upper West Side of New York. Paul writes beautiful music, and I think great music. So I asked him what set him and his fellow new tonalists apart from their postmodern predecessors. Now, Paul has a philosophical turn of mind, and he thought a moment before answering. Then he told me, the difference is that I try to compose beautiful things. I say what I mean and mean what I say. The irony in my work is not glibly, facetiously postmodern, but rather the essence of making audible the experience of fundamental paradox and ambiguity. That is a very beautiful and thoughtful remark. But Osama bin Laden and his Taliban cronies, the ones who banned the joy of music from Afghanistan, would scarcely have approved of such talk. For them, as for every other zealot who murders in the name of a false god, earthly beauty was a mere illusion, a distraction from the one true cause. But if September 11th taught us anything, it was that beauty is real as evil. Now, you will have noticed that I've had nothing to say about religion for the past few minutes. I've been stressing two seemingly different words, beauty and reality. But the believing critic thinks about these words in a different way from the unbelieving critic. To begin with, and really to end with, we believe in the existence of truth. We know where it comes from. And because we know this, we expect the visible world, including the world of art, to make sense. We also believe in the presence and possibility of grace, and we know that it can be made manifest in the least expected places. That's what most of Flannery O'Connor's stories are about, imperfect revelation. What happens to a flawed human being who is suddenly irradiated by grace? If he's an artist, the results may be utterly surprising. A village atheist like Verdi, or an Oxford-educated agnostic like Vaughan Williams, may find himself composing music whose effect is unmistakably, unambiguously spiritual. A Hollywood movie whose characters spew the F word in all directions may turn out to be about matters of the utmost spiritual significance. That's one of the reasons why I write about popular culture, by the way, and about movies in particular. I'm looking for sprouts of moral seriousness among the kudzu of secular foolishness. Or, to put it another way, I'm looking for the presence of grace. Walker Percy once pointed out that a visit to the neighborhood theater is for many Americans maybe the only point in the day, or even the week, when someone, a cowboy, a detective, a crook, is heard asking what life is all about, asking what is worth fighting for, or asking if anything is worth fighting for. Out of that insight grew The Moviegoer, a very great novel about a man who goes to the movies in order to drug himself against the shallowness of American life, unaware that by doing so he is embarked on a search for meaning that will ultimately end in his embrace of Christianity. Now, The Moviegoer is a novel, a work of verbal art, one whose meaning exists on a level more explicit than that of a painting or a symphony. But as I grow older, I find myself more and more impressed by what verbal and nonverbal art forms have in common. Of course, their differences are self-evidently obvious, so much so that I don't know that they require discussion. But remember, too, that we call all of them art, which suggests that we intuitively understand them to be fundamentally similar. But how can that be? Gilson wrote about the unity of philosophical experience, but is there such a thing as the unity of artistic experience? Now, I know myself to be venturing into deep waters here, for I am not a trained philosopher or any other kind of philosopher, just an interested amateur. But my personal experience may still be relevant in this connection, because I happen to be, as far as I know, the only critic in America, maybe anywhere, who writes about all the arts: painting, movies, literature, ballet, music of all kinds, everything. And because I do this, because I spend my days and nights immersed in all the arts, I find, increasingly, that for all their palpable differences, it is clear to me that there is a meaningful sense in which, as Clement Greenberg claimed, all art is one. More and more I find myself reaching into one art form for metaphors that will illuminate another. Just the other day, for example, I was writing about Miles Davis, the jazz trumpeter, and as I sat at my computer, suddenly out came the following paragraph. Interestingly, some of Davis's innovations were analogous to those of the modernist painters who were his contemporaries. Davis systematically pared down the maximalist language of bebop to create a new style full of wide-open harmonic spaces that allowed players to improvise more freely and flexibly, an approach reminiscent of the way in which such color-oriented abstract expressionists of the 50s as Mark Rothko and Helen Frankenthaler sought to develop a less spatially congested alternative to the canvas-crowding all-over abstraction of Jackson Pollock. Now, to me, the interesting thing about that paragraph was that it did just come out. I wasn't saying to myself, gee, wouldn't I look smart if I compared Miles Davis to Mark Rothko? But I wasn't reaching for an effect. I was making what, for me, was a natural comparison. And while you might say that that says more about me than it does about art, I'd say exactly the opposite. Once again, it strikes me that this kind of perspective may well come more naturally to a believing critic, to one who believes, for one thing, in the consubstantiality of beauty and reality. In recent years, I've often had occasion, in writing about classical music, to speak of the natural law of tonality, and to assert that the non-tonal musical constructions of the avant-garde modernists are unnatural, by which I mean, quite literally, that they go against the laws of nature. I can't imagine that such language, or the thinking behind it, would come easily, if at all, to an unbelieving critic. Which brings me to my confession of a believing critic, my credo. I believe in the objective reality of truth and beauty. I believe that insofar as it aspires to beauty, all art is one, And I believe that it is through this beauty that we receive our clearest apprehension of that which we cannot know in any other way. Through a glass darkly, except that the glass of art is not dark, but stained in deep and wondrous colors that permit us to catch a glimpse of what, seen directly, would blind us. I once had a friend, a Catholic of the most ultramontane inclination, who was also a great lover of old-fashioned jazz. Some of you here may possibly remember him. His name was Neil McCaffrey, the man who founded the Conservative Book Club. Neil worked hard, harder than anyone I've ever known, but every Friday night, without fail, he would knock off his duties and retire to his study, where he kept thousands of old 78s, all painstakingly annotated and filed in alphabetical order. He'd sit in his ancient easy chair, and his wife would load up a TV tray with a meatless meal. It was Friday, you know. And he'd spend the whole evening listening to jazz records, which he played in undeviating alphabetical order, Neil being a very methodical man. It was a sort of aesthetic Sabbath, though I would never have said so to Neil's face, for late in his life he invited me to come to his house on Fridays, eat macaroni and cheese, and listen to jazz. A year or two into our Friday night sessions, Neil learned that he had terminal cancer, a piece of news that he faced with the unselfconscious faith he brought to everything he did. We still got together most Fridays. In fact, we had our last session together the night before he died. A few months before that, not long after he got the bad news, he and I were talking in between records, and he said to me very reflectively and not a little bit sadly, "You know, Terry, I've spent most of my life listening to jazz and thinking about it, and I love it dearly, but I've never been able to see what it has to do with my spiritual life, if anything." Now, it is a truth universally acknowledged that nobody ever thinks of the perfect answer on the spot. But for once in my life, I opened my mouth and the right thing came out. I said, "Well, Neil, I've always thought that music, any beautiful music, including jazz, is our window on the transcendent." And this dear, wise, sick old man thought about what I'd said, nodded his head, and replied, "I never thought of it like that." And then he smiled. I'm sure it isn't exactly like that. We can't know. All will be made manifest in due course. Presumably that which awaits us is a beauty so complete and all-embracing that we cannot even begin to imagine the millionth part of it. In The Great Divorce, C.S. Lewis's allegory of heaven and hell, an artist comes to the outskirts of heaven and says that he'd like to paint it, and an angel tells him that won't be necessary. So he goes back to hell. I'd say that's a pretty good working definition of vanity. But until we come face to face with the source of earthly beauty, which shall render all paintings and sculptures and symphonies unnecessary, we are blessed to be able to revel in the works of those great artists who are in tune with the hidden soul of harmony, who have it in them to order the world of sound and light, and in so doing to remind us that our home is elsewhere. And that's what it means to be a believing critic, to believe in the power of beauty, and also to have faith in its ultimate meaning, to transcend ourselves and so become ourselves. Art and criticism can have no greater purpose. Now I'm going to answer questions if you have any, and a microphone will be brought to you so that all can hear and it can go on the tape. So if anybody would like to ask me anything, just raise a hand. And you'll have the opportunity to have a distinguished professor come running toward you with a microphone.
Running slowly.
Up in the back row, I think you're first.
I was just wondering, do you consider there to be like a moral limit to art of any sort? Like a moral limit?
A moral limit to art. Tell me more about what you mean by that question.
Is there any limit to sin, like in the movies or in poetry, profanity or...
Well, there's definitely no limit to the amount of sin people can put into movies. Do you mean that there's a point beyond which it's impossible to... that whatever artistic virtue the work of art has is poisoned by what it's presenting? Yeah, I think so. Maritain said you have to purify the source, that it's a question of intention. And I know that a great many people, we were talking about Flannery O'Connor before this meeting, a great many people who read O'Connor's stories for the first time who do not understand what they're about and what perspective they're being written from can be quite shocked by them. But when they realize what they're about, I think usually the shock falls away and they understand that they are in the highest degree morally serious. But there's a difference between Flannery O'Connor and some of the things that you might be likely to see at the local movie house. So much of it has to do with intentionality, I think. Others? In the middle?
Thank you very much for your presentation. You raise a series of issues I've been wrestling with for a number of years, and I'd just like to get your input in it.
I'm still wrestling, don't forget.
Okay. Good, we'll wrestle together. The title of your lecture tonight about a believing critic shifts the emphasis, I think, quite importantly to the receiver of the work of art. And each of us, as receivers of a work of art, bring a certain amount of baggage with us. And you, as a believer, might be able to see religious or spiritual implications, a movement of grace in a work of art that a secularist critic might be blind to. And
if only because I believe in grace, which they don't.
Okay, this is leading us to the question that I wanted to raise then. Does this really close a circle and bring us back to a kind of subjectivism in the perception of art that really borders fairly closely to a postmodernist interpretation of your opinion as a believer is qualitatively the same as my interpretation as a non-believer, and if someone is from a different culture and has a different value structure, that interpretation is also valid because we perceive different things in the same work of art.
I think I may have fallen victim to the reader response theory or something like that.
Something like that.
Well, in the short run, the answer is yes. In the long run, the answer is no. This is something that I think that Greenberg is especially sound on, because he emphasizes the necessity for a consensus of taste to emerge over time. In the short run, I think I'm right, but I have nothing to go on other than the tuning fork that is inside of me. One thing that I often wonder about, by the way, is whether or not I might be imputing the presence of grace to certain works of art out of a sense of wishful thinking. I am aware of that as a possibility, and it's something that I think that some Catholic critics very much do out of a sense of wishful thinking. They want the things they like to be good, and so they'll push a little farther. But criticism in the short run is conjectural. It's only in the long run that canons are formed, and that in the very long run it becomes clear to us. There is no question in our minds about the value of Mozart. There's no question in our mind about the value of Rembrandt. The particular details of specific interpretations are one thing, but on the most fundamental level of quality, I don't think that the doubts hold up all that long. But certainly, in the short run, we are competing in a market in which we want to put forward persuasive interpretations. And that's what I'm in the business of. I just wrote a book about a man, H.L. Mencken, who said that all criticism is prejudice made plausible, which is a very nifty piece of phrase-making, and I don't think it's true at all. But that's what it feels like when you're doing it right at the moment. I think I'm right. I am about taste. I sell my taste. That's what I do for a living. People seem to take it seriously, otherwise they wouldn't purchase it. It seems to find a responding echo in large numbers of people. But it is only in the longer run that we can know what those ultimate values are. The very best critic, the perfect critic, would be somebody who intuited them immediately, somebody who always knew a masterpiece when he saw one. Now, some masterpieces, I think most people really do know when they see them, but some are a little more subtle. That's a roundabout way of answering your question, but I hope it sheds a little light. And did you, ma'am, also want to? There's plenty of room.
Okay.
Jorge will run around just as much as we...
I appreciate it. I'd like to ask you to say some more words, if you would, about irony. You described at one point a conversation between yourself and another person. I can't remember
Yeah, the
who it was.
composer friend I was talking about,
Person.
Paul Moravec, yeah.
And it seemed as though he evolved a definition of the kind of irony that was not postmodern, not contemptuous, and not relativist, even though it to some extent would put in quotation marks
Right.
certain kinds of things. And the way out, the way into the good irony always turns out to linger around a word like paradox, as though something like paradox or dissonance is not the same thing as atonality or any unnatural kind of thing.
No, that's right. I mean, to
And
speak
I'd
about
like
it in a
to hear you-
specifically musical context, dissonance only makes sense in a world of tonality. I don't know how many of you are musicians, but I mean, a dissonance is something that you hear and it feels sharp and uncomfortable, and you feel that it needs some release. That's the most layman-like way I can think of describing it. But in a world where there is no natural law, there is no tonality, then there can be no dissonance, because there is no background of truth against which to set the falsity. There's no background of certainty against which to set the uncertainty. Paul and I both are reacting. I mean, irony is a good and serious and important thing. It's a fundamental part of art. The phrase I used, if you'll remember, is irony light, which in my manuscript is spelled L-I-T-E. And that is the irony that seems to have beset the culture in the last decade and a half or so, a kind of flippancy where you have the surface of irony, the surface mannerisms of irony, but there's no underlying belief that it bounces off. It's all mannerism, and I think that that's part of the swamp of postmodernism that a lot of artists have gotten themselves caught up in, and that I think increasingly the best ones are liberating themselves from. But I would never imagine or want an artistic world that had no irony in it at all, because sometimes irony is the correct response to what Paul calls the fundamental paradox and ambiguity of the human condition. It is not all made manifest to us yet. We are waiting for that. We're struggling for the final reckoning. And in our condition, sometimes irony is the right response to that imperfect knowledge, I think. But we're a long way from that in the irony of postmodernism, the irony of the eternal quotation marks, where everything is said with a wink and nothing is taken seriously. I think I saw somebody over on this side. All the way back on the other side. Last night I spoke somewhere where they had two microphones, one on either side of the house. Yes, sir.
What do you say when an artist describes his work as purely formalist, content-free? Is there such a thing? And can you still, what do you as a critic do then in responding to it?
Well, if that's what he thinks it is, that's fine. I mean, it all starts with form. I mean, the form has to be charged with something. But remember, I am a musician by training and am entirely accustomed to dealing with art forms that have no paraphrasable verbal content. So when, as a young man, I first saw abstract art, whereas some people are puzzled by it because, you know, it's not a tree, I looked at it and said, well, that's like music. Music works that way. And in ballet, we have something that's called a plotless ballet. I mean, your standard 19th century ballet is like the Nutcracker or Swan Lake. It has a plot, nobody's saying anything, but you understand the relationships. You know, these people are lovers, and you know, this is the cruel stepmother, and it has a paraphrasable verbal content. I can describe it to you. But when a master choreographer like George Balanchine makes a piece like, say, Concerto Barocco, which is a ballet with no plot at all, set to the Bach two-violin concerto, the temptation is to say, well, this is a purely formalist act. But Balanchine wasn't having any of that nonsense. Balanchine, who was himself a Russian Orthodox, said, well, of course it has plot. It's a man and a woman dancing together. How much more plot do you need? So he never used the term abstract to describe these ballets. He would call them plotless. One of the interesting things about art is that the people who make it don't always completely understand what they have made. That is a fascinating aspect of art. This may be because they have become receptacles of grace and are not fully aware of the revelation. Balanchine said that he thought that dancers were like angels, that they carried the message but did not experience it. So I'm not troubled by an artist's possibly incomplete apprehension of what he or she thinks he's doing. But pure form, nothing but form, mathematical spirals traced out on a piece of paper. It may be beautiful in the way that something directly from nature is beautiful, but art is not directly from nature. Art is something that we do because we want to see something that doesn't exist in nature. This is something that the neo-Thomists who have written about art are especially interesting about. I mentioned Etienne Gilson's Painting in Reality, a book by a Catholic philosopher married to an artist, an abstract artist, who brings the equipment of philosophy to bear on the experience of art. One of the most extraordinarily illuminating books I've ever read on this subject. I'm always recommending it to people. And it's something you might want to look at, too. My host has a question.
I think I'd like to hear something more about the Upper West Side and your New York audience, your unredeemed New York audience, and your sense of vocation as a critic against them. You didn't describe yourself as Catholic, but
I'm not, as a matter of fact.
May I ask?
I'm a fellow traveler.
A fellow traveler. I'd be curious to know, this is almost in the realm of gossip, what the history of your religiousness is, and also you've talked about how it gives you a vantage point against your New Yorkers. Is it a disadvantage in some respects? And maybe I'd like to hear more about, do you think things are changing? You say post 9/11, you feel your audience is coming round to your point of view? I know something in that area. I'd like to hear more. Artists
seem to be changing. That's a whole bunch of questions. Let me see how I can disentangle them. I guess I'll start backwards and work my way backwards. I had seen before 9/11 evidences in many different branches of the arts that younger artists were increasingly disenthralling themselves from postmodern relativism and irony light. And what struck me after 9/11 was the immediate salient need of the people around me in New York for an art that was sustaining, that had something more to offer than the glib irony that Paul and I are dismissive of. Whether or not the events of 9/11 have been a trigger changing the perceptions of more artists or simply drawing our attention to something that was already there, it's a little bit too soon to say, I think. 9/11 has certainly generated a lot of really awful plays that I've seen in New York. It isn't going to be an entirely good development. You don't want to swing extremely in the direction of hyper-earnestness, which is one of the things that happens in a time of war, when art suddenly becomes enlisted in the service of a cause. That's no good. But I think what I had felt even before 9/11 was the postmodern moment had exhausted itself. And I continue to see those tendencies in the art that I'm seeing, at least the art that is speaking to me and to a growing number of artists that I know. Living on the Upper West Side of New York, now, the thing that really struck me was when you asked me if I thought it might be in any way a disadvantage to be a believing critic. It just depends on how you use the belief, I think. I mean, obviously, one can be a blinkered critic, as have been so many people, some of the people I was talking about by implication in the speech, who are not open to the immediate experience of art. They may be afraid of art. They may not be strong enough in their belief to be prepared to expose themselves to surprising things. I don't think that's a problem, and for me personally. And the people I know who talk to me about my work all tell me how struck they are by how unusually receptive I am to an unusually wide range of things. They call me unpredictable, and I like that, because with art, experience has to come first. The immediate experience must come first, and then understanding of it. The real problem is when you start with the theory and then look at the art and try to make the art fit the theory. Art has to start with the immediate experience. So at least in my immediate experience, I don't think that I have been blinkered or narrowed by the fact that I'm a believing critic. I just don't think so. And nobody has seriously suggested it to me. And that brings us all the way back to the evolution of my own religious, my religious background and the evolution of my thinking. I was raised on the fringes of fundamentalism in the Midwest, what Mencken in his most famous coinage called the Bible Belt. It wasn't good enough, and I went through a long period of drift and uncertainty and very shaky agnosticism, and started working my way back in the right direction, and have been, as I think is clear from what I've been saying for the last few minutes, very deeply influenced in particular by the Neo-Thomists. And I have to leave it at that for this moment. I don't know where I'm headed, but I'm going somewhere. The very back row. Yes, ma'am.
Hi there. You were speaking about the unity of art and how art can be beautiful in many different ways and how it comes in many different forms, and that's why you're a critic of like all the arts. But I was wondering, since you are a critic, when or I guess why would you respond with negative criticism to a piece of art? I mean, how do you respond to people who think there's such a thing as bad art? Or I was wondering your thoughts on that kind of.
Well, I have no doubt in the world that there's such a thing as bad art. I have lots of it crammed down my throat every week in the course of my business as a critic. At this point in my life as a writer, I mostly choose the things that I'm going to write about. I'm rarely assigned to do things. And I have simply come to feel that it suits my own needs and maybe my own abilities best to write about things that I do like, that I think are good art. Silence is a very powerful form of criticism, and not to write about something, to pay no attention to it, may in my case be a statement that I'm not interested in it. But for me, it really has just been, especially in the last 5 or 6 years, however much time I have left on this earth to write about the arts and about beauty, I mostly want to spend it writing about things that I think are beautiful and trying to bring other people to them and widen their experience. Now, every once in a while, I do get a burr under my saddle and write something pretty rough, but I don't do that much anymore. I'm not saying that people shouldn't do it. Negative criticism is very important. It clears the table and allows us to concentrate on what is good. But for me, right at this moment in my life, it's mostly not the thing that I want to be doing. And that really does say more about me than it does about art. Maybe it's a spiritual exercise. That's the best I can answer you. In the center? Yes, sir.
This is picking up on some of the things that you've said or suggested, and maybe it's just a big balloon that I ask you to see what you want to do with.
I like to pop balloons myself.
It's the idea or the suggestion that beauty, rather than being something that is, it's something that happens. In other words, it's not, things are not beautiful, but human happenings, which are often stimulated by things that are made and such. Is that something you'd want? That picks up on what you said about Neo-Thomism.
It sure does, and you remind me. This is the person who writes about all the arts reaching into another direction, of something that the very great jazz pianist Bill Evans, who was quite introspective about his work, said. He was asked to define jazz, and he said, "Jazz is not a what; it's a how." All art is doing and making. I think, and in a way I'm only beginning to think about these questions. I'm thinking that maybe several years down the line I may want to write about them. It's possible that all the doing and making is an attempt to get at something that is already existent, that it's a closer and closer and asymptotic approach of something that already exists. Elgar said that music was written on the skies and that all you had to do was look up and write it down. And one feels this especially with the work of sculptors. It's always striking to see how there emerges from this large, undifferentiated block of stone, through a process, something that seems, the illusion we have is that it was previously existent. This is something that artists talk about all the time. Stravinsky said that he was the vessel through which the rite of spring passed. It's striking how often artists use this kind of language, which implies that they are receiving something. They're receiving a revelation, and that what they're attempting to do is make it manifest as clearly as possible through their imperfect human powers, but that they're receiving something that is larger than what they're doing. I know as a writer, that's the closest that I come to being an artist, is to writing pieces of prose. I often have the startling experience of feeling that when I sit down to write, that I've been filled up with the piece, that it's already written, and that all I have to do is get it down on paper. Wagner said that the entire, I think it was the Meistersinger prelude, came to him simultaneously. The entire experience came to him simultaneously. The perceptions of artists about what they're doing, about this creative experience, they're endlessly interesting to me. But I think I would have to say that these two things are completely commingled, existence and process. That's my instinct at this point in my thinking about it. Does that tally with your experience at all? Yeah.
We're thinking basically in the same direction.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Have we anyone else? Yes, sir.
Could you talk a little bit more about what you said at one point about art in the American culture and the sort of lack of appreciation for it? Or what do you think would have caused that disinterest?
Well, it has something to do with the fact that this country has deep Puritan roots. And also that this country was a frontier that had to be settled gradually by people who really did not have a great deal of time to do much of anything but, kill the animal or dig the root cellar or build the house before winter started. Possibly because of these reasons, and most certainly because of the Puritan heritage, there is a large strain in the American national character of feeling that art is really only good as an instrumentality, that you can only be comfortable with it if it's like, a vitamin that you take in order to be better, or it has a sermon built into it. A whole lot of American novels are like that, and many American films as well. Art with nonverbal content is obviously a lot less likely to fall victim to that. It seems to be something that comes with the package of being American, this kind of distrust in the simple experience of art. that you see something beautiful, you experience something beautiful, and you feel its resonance within you, and that itself is the instrumentality. It's good in and of itself. I think we have, as a country, even now, a bit of a problem with this. And we shouldn't. Which is not to say that we have not produced wonderful artists in every possible field, because we have. The book that I'm bringing out, the Terry Teachout Reader that Yale will publish next year, is entirely about American art and artists, even though I have written about artists from other countries. But I found that I was particularly interested in the American temper as it reflected itself in art. So it's not that we don't produce absolutely first-class work. It's that maybe we don't always produce entirely first-class audiences. Maybe that's it. I'm not watching the clock. I'll go until the cows come home, but I assume that there's some point at which you'll want to stop. You didn't give me a glass of water either. I'm not sure how long I can go like this.
Thanks. I was just wondering, in light of your comments on the kind of Puritan background of our culture, in a sense, unless that changes somehow, then I wonder whether or not there'll ever be a kind of general receptivity of the sort you speak of for the arts in our country. I mean, it seems to me that to say, as you do, and I wholeheartedly concur that that there are sort of occasions of grace within something that is not necessarily intended to be that, even. So an unbelieving artist can still write something, a piece of music or a story or paint something that that almost, whether they realize it or not, does take one into another realm, or does show us something of beauty and reality and so forth in a way that maybe they didn't anticipate. That just seems to me a very incarnational view of things, you might say, that nature is perfected by grace, or could be an occasion of grace or something like that, whereas I just don't think that's in the sort of Puritan theological mindset.
No, it's not.
And so philosophy, you don't do philosophy for its own sake either. That's suspicious. The arts are very suspicious and so forth. And I just wondered whether you have much hope that that perspective itself might shift.
It's a young country. That's the first thing that I would say. I mean, we have to remember the time scale. We also have the advantage of youth, which is vitality. I feel increasingly that Europe is exhausted, in some ways maybe even decadent. We are still quite young. American music as a serious endeavor is essentially a century old. Jazz is exactly a century old. That's not very much time in the scale of things. Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead, but I have a feeling that we're going to be around for a long time, and I hope that we evolve in the direction that you and I both think is desirable. But surely it will only come if we continue to move away from the Puritan heritage, which, for all the strength that it provides, is also extraordinarily narrow. And I think as far as aesthetic matters go, it's choking, it's strangling. And we have come a long way from it when you really think about it. I mean, this is a country now where people go to museums just for entertainment. Of course, you know, they also, as we were talking about at dinner, they want to look at the labels and listen to the audio tours. But there are two things happening here. First, there's the feeling that it's really not okay unless I'm educated by it. But there's also the good impulse, which is I want to know more. And somewhere in the intersection of these things is a vector that takes us in a good direction, I hope. But you're right. There has to be a philosophical development in the American national character before there can be an openness to art, a complete openness to the immediate experience of art of the sort that is necessary, I think.
I think we've given Mr. Teachout quite a workout this evening over dinner and drinks. He had to endure the company of 4 philosophy types, and then our questions here tonight. Please join me in thanking him.
Thank you.